Afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon with Moat Casey and Associates to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on school finance. Hopefully you all are joining us this afternoon with lots of good questions and ready to hear information from all of the experts here. We have Joe Wisnowski, Dan Casey, and Lynn Moak today on the webinar, as well as myself, Catherine Knepp, and Josh Haney, the finance team here at Moat Casey. Just wanted to let you guys know the basics of how we're gonna work today. We will be posting this PowerPoint and the video of the webinar later, so don't worry if you have something that you'd like to go back and reference. And then also, we do have a chat feature here so that you can communicate with us throughout the webinar. Just know that those chat messages cannot be viewed by anybody other than the panelists, but don't worry, we will be stopping periodically at the end of each section to answer your questions. So I think if we're ready, Josh, without further ado, I'm gonna pass this off to Dan Casey to get us going.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your time. We appreciate it. This is Dan Casey. Appreciate you being here. The other thing I think will be posted, we had this morning a discussion about curriculum issues and grading and other kinds of things. I think some of that may be of interest to you, just kind of to ensure compliance so you're not running afoul of things later on when you're looking at the funding issues. This is an unusual time. I mean, if you look here in Austin, local economist here reported, you know, if you look 6 weeks ago, we had a 3% unemployment rate. Right now we're at 25% based on a report he gave to the city council or the city officials on Tuesday. A very unusual time to say the least, and I'm certainly in terms of your operations. So, but with that, I'll turn it over. I think I'll turn it over to the group here, and we'll proceed on this. Make best use of your time. Thank you very much for being here today.
Well, good afternoon. This is Joe Wisnowski. I'm going to start it off today talking about local property tax values and taxes, tax rates, and that sort of subject. We're going to switch over to Catherine and Josh to cover most of the material related to state funding and waivers and federal funding and waivers. And then a host of us are going to come back and wrap things up talking about what's going to happen in the 87th session. So we'll give you some comments about that sort of thing. Just a reminder, we will stop for checking the chat for various questions as we move along. With that, let me get started on the local property tax value information. Catherine, if we could move to the next slide. Thank you. As you might have guessed, we're all working in either our homes or other remote locations. So conducting a presentation like this is a new experience for just about all of us. Hopefully we don't have to get used to it for too much longer, but who knows in this environment. Right now with local property values, we're certainly awaiting the April 30th estimates. We anticipate seeing those pretty much on time, at least from what we've been able to determine with the various public reports from some of the appraisal districts. But we have heard various reports that CADs are indicating a potential late certification of the actual property values, normally due by July 25th. The difficulties of conducting in-person appeals means that it's probably going to take a bit longer for them to deal with the appeals of the values this year. You might want to reach out to your CADs and see how they're conducting appeals or how they anticipate conducting appeals in this environment. It's not at all clear that a lot of people will be comfortable doing in-person appeals until much later in the year than normally happens. Just a word about values themselves. You know, the values are set as of January 1. So tax year 2020, which will produce your tax levy for the 2020 and 2021 school year, will be based on value as of January 1 before all of this pandemic started. However, you know, if we can move to the next slide, we are hearing some CADs exploring the possibility of holding values at the 2019 appraised level rather than updating them for 2020. Controller Hager has stated he doesn't have any authority to waive the January 1 valuation date issue. However, tax code currently does not require reappraisals every single year. There are provisions in Chapter 25 of the tax code and in Chapter 6 related to it that reappraisal will occur on a schedule covered by the plan that each appraisal district has approved, and there's a timeline for approving those plans and submitting them to the controller and so forth. If reappraisals do not occur this year, either because an appraisal district has decided not to, or that was just part of their plan, it's unclear whether the controller's study would accept those local values if the CAD holds them at the 2019 level. That may put some districts in an unclear position regarding the legitimacy of their values. It shouldn't actually have much impact on most school districts, but if the values are found to be invalid, it could have some repercussions down the road. A lot of that's hanging in the air right now. Appraisal districts don't really know exactly what is expected of them at this point, other than to continue on with the appraisal process. We do know that in Bexar County yesterday, they considered a motion to set the values based on 2019. They did not act on it. There was not a second to the motion to do that. It's unclear exactly if that were to take place in each appraisal district, how that would impact certain kinds of special category values, such as the rendition of personal property values, which might fluctuate up or down depending on what's happening to specific taxpayers. And then there's special mineral valuations for oil and gas based on production prices of the preceding year. And that's a more complicated category. Automobile inventories are appraised based on sales activity of the preceding year. So there's lots of complications. You can't just take each taxpayer and say, this is your value. It's the same as it was last year. Particularly in the case of new improvements, it's a big question as to how new improvements are treated versus existing improvements to real property. So lots of issues that hopefully we see some resolution to over the course of the next month or so. Of course, appraisal leads straight into the issue that's new for the world of House Bill 3, and that's tax compression. TEA initially posted a rule to do the calculation of maximum compressed tax rate, the district level compression feature of House Bill 3. Back several weeks ago, after hearing some public comments, they've reconsidered many aspects of that rule, and their new rule, which won't appear in the Texas Register until tomorrow's edition, will actually look at the certified values from 2020 versus 2019 to make the calculation of the maximum compressed rate, the district compression factor that's part of House Bill 3. The rule that's proposed, will go into effect for this year, but if certifications are late, it may not be possible for TEA to calculate the Tier 1 compressed rate according to House Bill 3's parameters in time to meet their deadline and also your deadline to include that in your notice to notice of public hearing and tax rate adoption that you normally do for those traditional fiscal year districts in August. In terms of other issues, TEA has advised or is planning to advise July 1 districts to publish the voter approval rate. Remember, that's the new terminology for rollback rate, based on the state compression factor, which already is known, at least right now it's known, based on the controller's projection of property value growth for tax year 2020. That yields a Tier 1 rate of 0.9164. And that's been known for several months now based on the adoption of House Bill 3 and all of its related requirements. That guidance appears in some of TEA's responses to questions raised in the public hearing process and public comment process for the original rule as published. there's not much other guidance to give school districts at this stage.
Got it.
So we have that out there as what TEA's reaction is. If TEA calculates a lower maximum compressed rate based on your district local property values after certification occurs, then you can adopt a lower rate at the public hearing or after the public hearing even without republishing. At least that's what TEA believes is the appropriate response. Because some districts may be caught in this trap of not getting certified values in time, it may end up that that's the same advice they would give to every district on the traditional fiscal year calendar. You'll recall, many of you are aware that some appraisal districts, Harris County, for example, actually has a special law that allows them to certify values later, or at least historically, it's occurred much later than July 25th. So there's a lot of unusual circumstances we're going to confront for the first time, not just because of what is happening in the world of pandemics, but also because of the new provisions of House Bill 3. We're going to come back to the subject of House Bill 3 and funding as parts of the later segments, and we'll talk some more about some of those implications of what's happening. But we're going to turn now to the subject of elections. Back in March, mid-March, the governor issued a proclamation that would allow any May elections that had been scheduled to be postponed until November 3rd in order to avoid having to hold elections on May 2nd. After the governor's most recent order on the 31st, the Secretary of State has given even stronger guidance, basically telling all taxing jurisdictions, if you planned for a May election, you better move it now. The Secretary of State also reminded folks that the governor's order only allows the postponement until specifically the November 3rd date. Of course, that's the general election, and this year a presidential election year, so turnout's likely to be significantly higher than it historically is for November elections in odd dates, and certainly higher than what you'd expect in a May election. Elections on any other date will require permission from the governor. I have seen at least one instance of the governor providing for an election in a particular community. I think this was the city of Sundown. I noticed a report of that earlier today. So it is possible to allow for an election on another date, but you would have to seek the governor's approval to do that. And I suspect because of the way that the statutes are worded for things like school bond elections, that the governor would not necessarily allow a school bond election to take place on anything other than a uniform date. That, I think, is where we're at with the elections process. Let me check here real quick. We do have some other information related to open meetings. We could move on to that slide. And this is really more in the way of a reminder that Governor Abbott has given you permission to to suspend certain provisions of the Open Meetings Act. And it would allow for virtual meetings to take place and telephonic meetings. That's probably going to be what you have to consider for some of the summertime meetings as well. It's not clear how long our stay-at-home orders will be in effect. School boards have to still give written notice to the public about a way to participate and provide an electronic copy of any agenda materials if you're doing electronic meetings. School boards are going to have to provide the public with access to a recording. That's already a requirement for some of the larger school districts anyway. And you need to provide an opportunity for public comment. Many of you have already grappled with those issues because you've had board meetings over the course of the past several months. But those are some of the issues that we just wanted to remind you there are provisions to allow you to do it in something other than an in-person format. With that, that's kind of the end of the beginning, you would say. We're going to switch to the state funding and waivers sort of topics.
Joe, if I can hop in here real quick, we are working to get the slides back so they are visible for you all. But in the meantime, Joe, one of the questions that popped into the chat is, do TREs need to be moved to November as well?
I would have suggested that TREs must be held on November no matter what, based on House Bill 3's provisions. It's very, very difficult to get the proper notices published in time to do a May TRE, because it has to include the information about the April 30th estimate of property value. I think the legislature, while it's not explicit in the language, I think basically the language says it must be held on a uniform date. I think their intent probably was to have it on a November date. If you're trying to do a TRE in May, for example, that would be very difficult to achieve, because you have to call the election basically in time to hit that uniform date, which means you actually have to publish and hold your public hearings about the rate you are adopting several weeks before the May election date. And because that public notice requires the use of the April 30th estimate of value, it's difficult to see how the timing can actually work for a May election. I know there's some people who've been trying to figure that part out. I haven't quite figured out how to make all the provisions of law work for that. So I would say that if you were thinking of a TRE, you probably have to have that in November anyway. Keep in mind, and I think there's a slide later on where we remind you of this, if you're doing a TRE, you have to do the efficiency audit and have that available in time for consideration, I think at least 30 days before the actual election date. So there's a really compressed timeline. You almost basically have to have it finished right now in order to do that. Are there any other questions, Monica?
That's it for now. Thank you, Joe.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, who's going to start off on the state funding section.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Sorry about the screen sharing situation. I hope that it's fixed now. We're just having so many of you join that we're having some technical difficulties, but I think they're fixed now. So anyway, we're going to start talking about state funding and this crisis's impact on that. So first of all, attendance, major driver here. You probably know this already, that TEA has provided districts with 4 operating classifications: closed instructing, closed preparing, closed temporary, and open. I know that all of us are probably, or many of us are probably in the closed instructing right now, although many of us were definitely in the closed preparing section. At some point, we hope that we can be open again, but just remember these particular categories as we talk about waivers. So districts will not count the 5th and 6th weeks attendance in your usual way where you're taking the daily attendance, but TEA has promised that formula funding will continue to flow as long as schools commit to continuing student instruction during closure. So if you're one of those closed but instructing campuses, you need to have grade books and representative samples of student work to show that instruction is occurring. So again, just make sure that you have documentation. I think that that's probably the word of the day is document, 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 just to show that you are doing your best faith effort to make sure that you're moving forward in the right manner. And so here, when districts are closed but instructing, you must also submit these missed school day waiver attestations for each day your school is closed. This basically says that even though we're closed, we are doing our best to instruct our students, and these must be filed by June 18th. So this is an example. This is listed on the TEA webpage. Many of you have already notice that Moat Casey on our webpage has a COVID-19 resources Google document that you can access via our website. And all of these links are there for this particular attestation form, as well as many of the other things we're going to be talking about. I know that's probably going to be dropped in the chat box if it hasn't been already, but here's just one of those resources. This is also available on TEA's website. So TEA staff has informed us that a revised school finance FAQ is coming soon. So there's one currently posted, but we're talking a little bit about some methodology that we've been in consultation with Leo Lopez at TEA about, and he says that TEA will calculate initial refined ADA using the first 4 6-week periods for all districts, regardless of whether they reopen or not. And TEA will then calculate a historical ratio based on total refined ADA in the first 4 periods versus the last 2 periods of 2018-19. TEA has informed us that they'll use this same ratio to adjust total refined ADA will be used to adjust all of the other special counts used in the FSP. So look out for that school finance FAQ. We believe that's what it will say, but again, this situation continues to change, but that's what we've been told as of about yesterday.
And actually, sorry, Catherine,
yeah,
if I
go
could
ahead.
jump in there real quick. This is Josh Haney at Moat Casey. Could you go back to that last slide? Sure. The exact methodology that they're going to use for that ratio, this is something that districts have been emailing and calling us with questions about. TA hasn't spelled that out exactly, at least as far as I'm aware. And just to kind of draw a line under Catherine's point there, that same ratio calculated based on total refined ADA will be used for all the other student counts that are all the other ADA FTE counts. And so it may be good to go and look at, your historical trends in those areas and see, generally speaking, most districts will see a decline in total ADA compared when looking at the first 4 periods versus the latter 2 periods, but that may not be the case for some of those other student subpopulations. So it may be good to go and check kind of how those trends play out in your district.
Yeah, especially take a close examination of your special education counts, especially as students continue to be identified throughout the course of the year. That's something that I've noticed in studying particular counts that school districts have provided us over time. So then we've got state funding for compensation. So state funding to districts will not be negatively impacted by COVID-19 if you commit to providing instruction at home. So much of your funding goes towards compensation. I know some of you have have local policies to provide staff premium pay for either working overtime or as hazard pay, but that may be particular to your district's policy on the books. If your district doesn't have such a policy, you may think about establishing one, but remember that some of the reimbursement policies and protocols that we'll be talking about later may only apply if you have policies on the books prior to the COVID-19 crisis. So that's just a little asterisk there of something to be aware of. And then the advice here, staff paid with federal dollars, districts can continue to pay salary and hourly wage staff who are paid with federal grant funds administrative leave while the district is closed, as long as the district has a funding neutral local compensation leave plan policy that is applied consistently to local, state, and federal activities. So some good news there about just some consistency. But then with waivers and extensions, here are just some things to keep in mind as you think about next year and as you continue to implement programming into the future. Full day pre-K waiver deadline has been extended to July 1st. I know many of you have been trying to develop those programs this year, and it's been hampered by the recent events. Deadlines and due dates for applications and reports to TEA Grants Administration Division through May 3rd have been extended. And then the new grant opportunity that those of you of us that may have joined us this morning or had colleagues that did, we talked about the target support and improvement grants, and that just be on the lookout for those for those of you with target support and improvement campuses. So could be up to $220,000 per district. And then state waivers and extensions. Here are some things to make sure that you realize are not anticipated to change. So you are still required to have the 75,600 minutes of operation, but that can be met through the waiver and attestation process. But just know that that's still expected, and that you should move forward with adopting your budget before the start of the fiscal year, even though that there are some limitations on the property value reporting processes. Just do the best that you can to make sure that you've got this going on a normal timeline. And then the spending restrictions for a new school safety allotment, there could be some overlap though, but please, there's some guidance about this on TA's website about SB 11 and what you can use for the current crisis under those funds. And then the exclusion of food service delivery miles from FSP transportation allotment. Even though you aren't transporting your students on a daily basis to and from the school, you are advised not to use the mileage that you are racking up, maybe delivering food or other supplies as part of the normal transportation reports. And TA has said that it is monitoring these regulations and will determine if waivers are necessary at a later date. So these are just, things that we're currently watching. So districts and charter schools, you must still submit your annual financial audit within 150 days of the fiscal year end. So that should be on track. And issuance of first ratings should also be on track. And then one last piece of advice, enforcement of 55% spending requirement is still in place. The FAQ seems to indicate staff are leaning against offering this waiver. Note the question number 8 on the school finance FAQ. Again, this is an item that, especially if a new FAQ is issued or a revised one, to pay attention to, but right now you are still have that 55% spending requirement. Okay, and then I'm going to toss this over to Josh to cover federal funding and waivers, and I'll chime in at some point about FEMA reimbursement, but take it away.
Thanks, Catherine. Sorry, before Josh.
Oh, sure, we have some questions. Perfect.
We do. All right, so the first question that came through in the chat has to do with those, the missed school day waiver. Had a couple questions about whether they needed to submit one per day or can you submit for a range of dates?
I believe it's my understanding that you do actually have to submit a waiver for each individual day. We'll double check that though to confirm, but that is my understanding.
I believe that's correct, and you can't submit them ahead of time, right? So you can't, like today, submit them for the remainder of the year. You have to wait until the day occurs and then submit it afterwards.
Yeah, you actually have to have missed the day.
I believe that's the guidance, but along with the slides, we'll include a Q&A document with links to that specific guidance from TEA just to confirm.
All right, thank you. Next question, has TA given an estimate of when the new ratios will be available to districts? Will it begin showing up in our runs for our SOF?
They have not, and that's sort of what I was alluding to earlier. They haven't said exactly how that's going to be calculated or when it'll show up for your funding purposes. I think they are still nailing down that methodology, and I suspect that will be something they outline in the coming revision to the school finance FAQ.
All right, next, do we know how they will account for new HB3 funding elements with no historical data?
Yeah, and Catherine, Joe, feel free to chime in on this. It seems like they wouldn't, since they're just taking the total ADA historical ratio, they would just take whatever student counts you submit for those new allotments and just reduce them down by the total ADA ratio. And again, this is just from what I understand at 2:01 on April 9th. They will, this is only going to apply to the ADA FTE count. So obviously like comp ed, for example, That's all tied to the fall PEEM snapshot. I haven't heard any discussion about that being reduced, for example, right? So that wouldn't apply there. And then so probably something like that with CCMR bonus and some of those other items. Yeah, so that's sort of our understanding at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good reminder that things are tied to the snapshot, so that creates a little consistency. And then also, just as we've tried to calculate for certain districts, particular funding counts, some of those, like the early education allotment, are based upon other total numbers that you have. So even if that's not something that you can track, because it's specifically this year, it's based upon other things that you've typically tracked before in the past. So that's, especially with that early ed one, it's a combination of two counts that were already made. They just happen to be based upon a percentage of your population that's tracked instead of the whole population.
All right, we've got a few more coming in. This is a specific question I think we may need to do some follow-up on, but we have a district that's offering Wi-Fi accessibility using buses to students while they're closed, and they're offering instruction. They're asking if those miles could be counted for funding.
I haven't seen any guidance on that, and that I know a lot of districts are doing that, and so that's a good question. If I had to put forward a guess, I would say possibly not under the transportation allotment, but that is a cost that I would recommend tracking for possible reimbursement under another program.
We have got a couple more questions about the transportation allotment, specifically how transportation funding will occur. Is there more guidance you can provide on that right now?
Right, so there hasn't been, like for the student counts, right, they've sort of indicated that they're going to do this deflation factor based on historical ratios. I don't know if they're going to do anything similar for transportation. It doesn't really apply as I see it right now, but TEA has not really spelled out how they're going to, if they're going to make any adjustments to the transportation allotment based on what you guys are reporting. So we'll just have to stay tuned on that.
All right, I think that wraps up our Q&A for this particular section, so I'll let you all take it away.
Okay. Josh, I'll go ahead and advance to our first slide here.
All right, so we're going to start looking at some new federal resources that will be available here shortly. So just kind of taking an overview. I know many of y'all have been following this and asking us questions about it. So the U.S. Congress has passed 3 stimulus packages so far. The first 2 there were relatively small compared to the third one. But just wanted to give a little recap of what's in there, particularly with that phase 2 package. That does include extended FMLA and emergency paid sick leave, which has some implications for school districts that we'll talk about here on the next, either the next slide or right after that. Go ahead, Catherine. There we go. So yeah, this is the phase 2 bill that was passed. It's effective April 1st. It does, as I mentioned, provide some expanded FMLA benefits and emergency paid sick leave for employees who can't work, and it's tied specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic. Both of those provisions are temporary and they expire at the end of the year. And then we were getting some questions on, particularly from smaller rural districts, if that number of employee threshold in the bill pertains to them. And all the guidance we've seen, particularly from TASB and others, is that all public school districts are considered covered employers under FMLA. If there's any charters on the line, it does get a little bit trickier for them, whether or not they're considered a covered employer, and whether or not that threshold will come into play for them. So I think it's not clear to us. We would suggest reaching out to legal counsel if you are in that boat. But that last bullet point there about the posting requirements, that will apply to all the covered employers, the same way districts are required to post, put up the FMLA poster in the, teacher workspace, or in the various areas around your facilities. There's new posting requirements related to this expanded FMLA benefits. And then, I'm sorry, just go back real quick, Catherine, sorry. You can't, I realize you guys can't click on those right now. We will send out a document that where those links are clickable there at the bottom, but if you really wanted to dive into the nitty gritty on this, TASB has a good article that kind of walks through different implications. And then the Department of Labor has a very detailed Q&A. If you guys haven't seen that already, we'll be sure to send out a version of this presentation that's clickable, and you guys can go dive into that. And so one of the themes in this presentation is, what do we know right now? Because it seems like every day there's new guidance and revisions to old guidance. And so what we know right now about the major stimulus package, the phase 3, the one that was most recently passed, $13.2 billion will flow to what's been called the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Fund. This is going to function kind of like grants, and the way it'll be distributed is first down to the states, and the ratio will be in line with the Title I funds received for the most recent year. And then once that distribution has occurred, the states can keep 10% of that amount, and they're required to distribute the other 90% to local education agencies. And again, it's by that same ratio using Title I funds that are distributed. The commissioner in previous calls has estimated sort of a ballpark of what Texas could receive through this funding, somewhere between $1 and $1.5 billion. And then on the next slide, we'll get into, I believe, more. Yeah, so this is a Tableau data visualization that's sort of been spreading like wildfire across school district business offices. And I wanted to bring this up just to caution y'all that, this information is out there. However, and actually, yeah, thank you. We've sort of opened up the hood on this a little bit, and it does seem like the author follows that basic Title I ratio methodology. However, as a commissioner has said on his calls, there's a lot of guidance and additional implementation details that USDE or TEA still just haven't been written yet. So we don't know exactly what that amount will be. So just take any runs you see with a grain of salt, and just realize that there's a lot of rulemaking that needs to be done. And I saw a note from USDE just the other day saying they're working to get that out as soon as possible. They understand the need, and so those rules are being worked on as we speak. One other thing to mention about the CARES Act is it does include a maintenance of effort requirement, similar to the last stimulus experience we had here in Texas. And the way it works for the CARES Act is it's the maintenance of effort requirement covers the following 2 years, and it's based on the average over the preceding 3 years. And that's looking at the state support for education. And then before we move to reimbursements, are we getting any questions about stimulus funds, or are we ready to move on, Monica?
There's one question asking about an ETA on the funding.
I don't have that now. I just know, through all communication from USDE and TEA, they are working as quickly as possible. So that could mean in the next couple of days, I'd expect for some of those details to be fleshed out.
All right.
Yeah, no, and I think just to repeat what I was talking about earlier, which is a really nice bridge actually to this reimbursement section, is obviously there are some expenses that you guys are incurring that you would not normally have if we were doing school in school buildings. And so it's understandable that you're going out and doing what you have to in order to deliver education in a meaningful way. But one thing to think about in terms of federal stimulus aid as well as FEMA funding or any other kind of reimbursements is kind of keep in mind that those things may be available, but it's probably not wise to count on those money, those dollars coming to you. So don't run out and buy Wi-Fi enabled buses if you don't already have them, you know, unless that's absolutely necessary for the delivery of your program. So just keep in mind, don't be expecting necessarily a windfall, but do document your expenses. So here are just some examples of some things that we know that you guys are spending money on. Additional cleaning and sanitizing services, child nutrition expenses, printing and packet pickup, and just additional technology. I know that that's one of the things that we conducted a pre-webinar survey on, and a vast majority of you all were really just concerned with delivering technology to your students in order for them to access the most meaningful instructional programming that you can. So go ahead and track these expenses through a sub-object code so that you can track the expenses regardless of the fund the costs are part of. So child nutrition expenses are going to be in a different place than your communications costs or your cleaning costs, for example. So just document, track these things, and definitely, especially when we talk about formula funding here for FEMA reimbursements. On March 13th, 2020, President Trump issued a nationwide emergency declaration for COVID-19. And then a little bit later, FEMA announced the availability of public assistance through this particular FEMA designation. And school districts can engage FEMA's public assistance program for reimbursement for Category B emergency protective measures. So those of you that are in school districts that where Hurricane Harvey came upon your district, you're probably more familiar with this than school districts a little farther away from the coast. So this FEMA process is going to be a little bit different because it's limited to Category B emergency protective measures. But we're encouraging districts to keep track of all your expenses that are unusual for this period, knowing that you may be surprised to be reimbursed by some things, but again, not counting on that funding. So for those of you who are used to FEMA funding, you're used to getting assistance with cleaning up and recovering from destruction from natural disasters. And some funding that you may have gotten the last time under Category A would not be available under this Category B. And then it's also really important to note that the federal cost share is 75%, and the share for a district or charter school is 25%. So keep that in mind as well, that some of this reimbursement does come with your particular share. And then here's how to seek reimbursement. If you haven't done so already, I know many districts have already engaged this process, but you can participate in a brief virtual applicant briefing, doesn't last long. That's going to provide vital information on how to get yourself started, and then submit a request for public assistance or an RPA. You can complete this step actually prior to participating in the applicant briefing. And there's a little bit of a process in terms of how you go forward with this, whether or not you have already been part of the FEMA reimbursement process or not. The TEA FAQs do a nice job of outlining the steps. So print that out if you got a printer and follow step by step. It does a pretty good job of walking you through each scenario, depending on whether or not you've accessed FEMA funds or tried to access FEMA funds before. Now, here's one point of interest is that TA's FAQs state that the deadline for these requests is April 24th, but we've read FEMA communication that is talking about extending that deadline because the disaster is ongoing. It's not like a hurricane struck one day and then you've got 30 days to apply for assistance. clearly we're all experiencing the effects as this crisis continues. So that's just something to keep in mind, but go ahead and get that process started as soon as you can. So here are some nice tips as you go forward through this process. First of all, designate members of your staff to lead the FEMA reimbursement process. You really want to locate this process into just a couple of people that can stay on top of all the documentation, on top of all your costs, and communication with FEMA, because FEMA may not have the same representative talk to your district each and every time. And so it's helpful to have one person who knows everything that's been said, everything that's been communicated. That way, if somebody new comes on the phone from FEMA, you can rehash some of the information that you've shared previously, and you won't lose steps because you're not sure what's been communicated or what somebody else said. And then consider supplies you access that you already had in your inventory. You could consider these items as additional costs, even if you didn't go out and purchase these specifically, but you did use them specifically for COVID-19 preparedness. And then also consider some other things like overtime pay of staff, and keep documentation of superintendent cabinet meetings that address COVID-19 preparedness. Again, FEMA has not proclaimed that they will for sure, cover all of these costs or that they're naming them as eligible, but just keep track of them so you know what it cost you, and then you may also end up being reimbursed for them as discussions about what will be reimbursed and what won't be move on. As we all know, it's harder to reinvent documentation you didn't do than to already have it in your hand just in case. Okay, so Josh, did you want to talk a little bit about the federal waivers here? With
Yeah, and actually I wanted to bring Buck in.
Oh, yeah.
Buck, are you on the line? Can you unmute yourself?
I'm here.
Yeah. Hey, Buck, I was wondering, since you have experience kind of with FEMA, given districts that you've been a superintendent at, if you could maybe speak a little bit to what folks can expect during that process.
Well, and just what you all said, it's all about documentation and persistence. I do think that it's important that you have one point of contact, because when you're dealing with FEMA and any type of insurance for this, in these situations, normally you don't deal with just one agent from them. It's multiple agents. So every time that someone calls to ask a question, you have to start over. If you can have someone that keeps track of all of that information, and that person then can be your point of contact always in this reimbursement process. The second point would be just keep at it in this process. You're going to have to be persistent. This usually takes time, effort, and energy, and it's not very seldom is it an easy process. And so just keep at it, keep your documentation in order, and be prepared whenever they show up to ask you the questions.
And then, Monica, before we move on to waivers, are we getting any questions about stimulus funding?
We are.
Okay.
Yes. Thanks, Josh. We've got two that are similar to each other, so I'm just going to share both of these questions. We may not want to get into speculation, but the questions are, will Texas use the stimulus funds to backfill the revenue shortfall like they did in 2009? And a similar question, do you expect TA to use the CARES funding to supplant state funding as they did with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds back in 2009?
We had some,
Joe and
yeah,
Lynn,
go ahead, Joe.
if you guys want to weigh in on that. I know in
Sure, this is Joe. I'll weigh in. If they can, they will. That's the simplest answer. Right now, my understanding of the funding that's available in the CARES Act, most of it is directed to the school districts. It doesn't seem to allow flexible use like the ARRA money was. There is talk of another stimulus package that would have a much larger amount for support of public education, and it's unclear exactly how that will flow. So a lot of these things have not yet been determined, and the stimulus activity of the federal government is not yet over. But my supposition would be that if the state is allowed to repurpose the federal funds to support public education funding in the way that ARRA was, then they will do that because the state, as we will talk about in just a couple of minutes, will be looking at significant budget shortfalls for the next biennium.
Thanks, Joe. Another question, would we assume that the CARES Act would allow previous expenses incurred prior to the grant period?
I think, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, and thanks, Joe, I realized I skipped right over that point on the previous slide about potential phase 4 stimulus. And so, yeah, that all is being put together, subject to negotiations right now in DC. And yeah, oh, thanks, Catherine, if you wouldn't mind going back to the, it's back on the overview. On going. Yeah, right here. So as Joe mentioned, there's almost immediately after the phase 3, the CARES Act was signed, negotiations began on phase 4. And of course, it's still subject to much discussion, but there are some major education groups pushing for quite a bit more additional education funding. And specifically, it would be the like the national superintendents groups and others. And this is they've submitted a letter and some other recommendations, and this is kind of where they are where they're pushing members of Congress. And so it could, I've seen other items included on this, such as infrastructure spending or an additional direct payment. A direct payment to folks. So it's, again, this phase 4 stuff, do not, take it with a grain of salt. This is just part of the conversation that's swirling right now. But we will, hopefully some more details on that will come soon. Going back
Josh?
to, oh, yes, go ahead.
That slide, well.
Which slide are we talking about?
More.
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, on that slide where it talks about phase 3 and the 13.2 billion, I seem to remember that there's a requirement that 90% of that flow to school districts. Is that your recollection?
Right. Yeah, and that's what I mentioned earlier on that phase 3 slide. Yeah. So it goes first from the federal to the state based on Title I. The state can scrape off 10%, and then they're required to send the remaining 90%. Down to districts, and then the proportion is still, again, based on Title I. That $3 billion for the governor's education fund has a little bit different distribution, but it's more, there's more discretion given to governors in that, so it's even harder to say how that will be distributed down to districts.
But when you put the Texas share of that money in context of the cost of the foundation school program, it's not really a lot of money.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. And then again, I'm seeing some questions about when can districts expect this. We don't know at the moment. Again, rulemaking is happening as we speak on all of that. And as soon as information is available, we'll be sure to send it out.
Joe, do you want to talk a little bit about how the process did work back the last time we went through something like a major loss and the change in the economy?
Well, why don't we put that off till Josh has a chance to go through some of the slides related to the state budget. I think it probably fits better there than right here.
Okay.
We had another FEMA question come in asking what has to be completed with FEMA by April 24th. Is that just setting up the account?
Again, I think that some of that's going to be flexible based upon the FEMA communication that we've seen, but I think the RPA, the request for public assistance, will be part of that. I know that then there's some follow-up activity that FEMA has to do once they've received your request. So at a minimum, I would try to get that in, but unclear as to what details would need to be completed within, maybe if somebody, a school district, I don't know if Buck could speak to what his experience was like during Harvey in terms of the timelines. But again, I think the most important piece is that there's going to be some flexibility about the process beyond the 24th anyway.
Yeah, I would have the application turned in by the 24th. Again, normal FEMA operations are that there's a point in time disaster that you're dealing with, and then the aftermath of that. Being an ongoing disaster kind of puts everything into flux. And so if you could get your application completed and then begin to compile the documents and documentation that you need as you go through filing that. You know, again, don't want to get anybody's necessarily hopes up that FEMA is going to step in here. We'll have to see, as Josh has said multiple times, how all of these different funding procedures work, and move that through each of those areas of all of these already passed bills, the bills that are going to be passed, and then as it works through rulemaking at the state level for flow through to school districts. So for this, the piece that FEMA plays in there, nobody's going to be quite sure until we get those rules finalized.
All right. So if we're ready to move on, I can start talking about federal waivers. The U.S. Department of Education has announced some flexibility with federal expenditure requirements. There's a long list of them, and TEA has already applied for this waiver. Last I heard, USDE has approved some states' waivers in this area, but not Texas's yet. And so I have a request into TEA to provide some updates on that, whether or not Texas's has been approved, but according to press reports and information from USDE, Texas's specific waiver has not been approved yet. And then, so just specifically, again, there's several items that, several areas that USDE is providing flexibility on. I just list two there, the 15% carryover limitation and the extension of the period that you can reach back in prior years for many of the title funds. So I would make sure that your federal program staff and federal program director have been made aware of the waivers announced by USDE and make sure that they take a look at the request from TEA to USDE, because it doesn't perfectly overlap with what USDE has announced they will waive. So that may be what the sticking point is kind of what the delay is on getting Texas's waiver approved. So that's sort of what we know at the moment. One other item to note there is this flexibility was included in the CARES Act. And then in their announcement, USDE said that they're offering this flexibility specifically for schools to use these funds for technology infrastructure and teacher training. And so again, specific rules on, does expenditure X qualify in either of those two buckets are to come. But that's what USDE has announced up until this point. One area that they are holding the line on and not offering a whole lot of waivers from is the requirements related to special education, including those established by the Rehabilitation Act and IDEA. And so a lot of those specific questions are outlined in TEA guidance, and then also on the USDE website, they have quite a few documents going over sort of what's expected out of school districts regarding the provision of special ed services during this time. One thing that caught my eye when I was looking at sort of updated guidance from TEA is they promised an additional document in the coming days looking at whether special ed students can be served in a non-virtual setting. I'm assuming that means a physical setting without violating shelter-in-place orders. And so there may be, TA may be opening the door a little bit to that, and kind of how all of those things mesh with the shelter-in-place orders. And so just be tuned in for that. That'll probably come in the coming days. And then Catherine, do you want to take the lead on the child nutrition stuff here?
Sure. Yeah, no, as many of you are, or most of you are intimately aware of, one of the very first things you probably did before you thought about instruction was just making sure that your students were fed during this process. And certainly that has some expense attached to it. So the USDA and TDA have announced that they will waive the following child nutrition program requirements, among others. You're probably familiar with the Square Meals website, but continue to check those as those waivers continue to be approved at the federal level. So first of all, a parent guardian may pick up meals without children present, but make sure that you have proper documentation in order to make sure that that those meals will be reimbursable. And obviously meals can be provided in a non-congregate setting, as you guys know, as you have those students take those meals home. And then certain nutritional food group requirements for meals, that is the meal pattern. Make sure your Food Service Administration is in contact with TDA when you have to go outside of meal pattern, because that is on a case-by-case basis. I think the idea from the webinars that I've been a part of from TDA is that they're trying to maintain the integrity of the program. So making sure that those meals are reaching the desired people, and making sure that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of feeding students when they would have otherwise been at school. And then of course, meal service time requirements. I know that there's been some conversation about weekend and holiday meal provision. I know that that's kind of ongoing, the conversation in terms of whether those things will be reimbursable depending on the day, but just stay tuned for some of those details. Okay, and then also just in terms of extensions for reimbursements. So the due date for January 2020 reimbursement claims has been extended to the end of the month. And then February ones have been extended to the end of next month. So good news about that. And I guess we may want to pause and see if anybody has any particular questions about any of the federal things that we just finished talking about.
Yep, thanks, Catherine. We had one come in about just the various stimulus funds. So one participant asked, do you believe it would be easier to access stimulus funds through the CARES Act versus FEMA? They're considering not applying to FEMA if CARES can cover the incurred costs. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the idea with FEMA is what has been communicated in the various webinars, et cetera, that I have been a part of, is that FEMA is definitely going to be sort of the last to cover and reimburse certain costs. So there's wisdom in thinking, okay, maybe the stimulus funds may reach you, but I would just encourage districts to just go ahead and apply for that reimbursement through FEMA, because you don't know what you will be reimbursed for. Again, don't count on the funding. but there may be, especially given the novelty of this particular crisis, there may be some things that that get covered. But again, yeah, the FEMA funds, they've definitely communicated, are the things you're not going to get duplicative funding, you know, some from FEMA and somebody else in order to cover the same item.
We had another question come through about coding losses. So for example, like lost travel due to a loss of revenue stream. Can we provide some guidance on coding losses?
Yeah, definitely keep track of all of the things that you've had to cancel, whether they be events or otherwise. Yeah, because certainly those are some of the things in your planning processes that you've had to keep track of. So there's actually, and we can include this as part of our follow-up FAQ, like basically a spreadsheet that FEMA has, or I've seen in FEMA resources, of ways to track costs. And I think that that's one of the things that you can put on there, because it helps you keep track of eligible costs and non-eligible costs and all the different items with that. So, you know, especially if you include that as part of your documentation under that specific sub-object code, I think that can be a helpful way to organize it.
Great, just one more, if we can just back up to the previous slide, looking for the extension dates for reimbursement. Perfect.
And those are also provided on the Texas Department of Agriculture website, and we can include the link in our little Q&A document that we send out to y'all after the conclusion of the presentation. All right, so we'll move on to, not that y'all don't have enough to think about right now, just getting through the day, but we'll try and provide some sort of look forward to next session. And so if y'all watched the controller's interview on the Texas Tribune earlier this week, he sort of, we're still waiting on a lot of the specific revenue data to come in. I'll talk about that here more in a little bit, but just given what his staff has been able to see based on the limited economic data coming in, it seems it's apparent to him that Texas is in a recession, but you know, the depth and width of that recession is just not known yet. And so here's kind of what we do know, or some forecasts that are out there right now. The Federal Reserve and the St. Louis branch of the Federal Reserve put out a forecast a couple days ago that put the nationwide unemployment rate next quarter at 32%, which was a bit higher than other forecasts we've seen. I think earlier in the presentation, Dan mentioned a forecast from an Austin economist that was around 25% for the Austin area. Around the state, we've seen various regional forecasts that range from 10 to 25%. Which is kind of surprising given that we're also having in Texas sort of a double whammy here because of the low oil prices. So it's kind of surprising to see our forecast for Texas be lower than national forecast given that. And so just to remind y'all, the current biennial budget was relying on a forecasted price of around $50 to $55 per barrel. The price as of last night when we checked it was around $26, so obviously about half. And so that will definitely have an impact on, you know, money flowing into the rainy day fund and to other funds that rely on severance taxes. And then just this morning, new unemployment claim data was released. You can see, just kind of put this in historical perspective, that gray shaded area on the left obviously is labeled Great Recession. So you can kind of see a little spike there and then another little spike with Hurricane Harvey. But just the scale that we're seeing now, and I'm sure y'all have read the news reports of the Workforce Commission just being overwhelmed with calls and people trying to put claims in. This is really on a scale that we just haven't seen in recent history. And just to kind of give a little recap and just a little refresh on, you know, what specific tax revenues does Texas rely on to fund the Foundation School Program? Of course, it's largely sales taxes, particularly with the Foundation School account, and then also with the Tax Reduction and Excellence in Education Fund. That's a new account that also relies on sales taxes down there towards the bottom. And then there's some other franchise tax, you know, and cigarette tax that go into the Property Tax Relief Fund. But on the next slide, we're just going to focus mostly on sales tax. Here's kind of where we are on this fiscal year through March. And again, this only sort of covers economic activity. It's lagged, so it covers economic activity that occurred in February. And so up until this, you know, prior to coronavirus, the impact on the economy, we were on track to hit the controller estimate. Historical trends for at that point in the fiscal year were around 56, 57%. However, I just want to point out that we don't have revenue data that would indicate that indicates sort of the true impact of the coronavirus on state, you know, state tax revenues. A couple items again that were mentioned in Controller Hager's presentation with the Texas Tribune earlier this week. He did mention that the controller will come out with a revised revenue estimate this summer. And then he also sort of provided some assurances that in his staff's estimation that in terms of short-term cash flow needs, they were projected to, you know, they were able to keep state funded, and in his opinion, that sort of reduced the urgency for any calls for a special session. However, he has said that his staff is preparing a report for state leadership to show what kinds of savings would occur if agencies started making some cuts during the interim. But then immediately after that, he said certain areas of the budget would be excluded, at least currently, and that included the FSP and some health and human service expenditures. And so this slide just kind of shows a recap of what tools are, you know, could be available to legislators when they come in back into town in January, presuming there's no special session. The original forecast at the end of last session put the surplus at about $2.9 billion. Of course, since then, the controller has stated that that is likely to not materialize due to the economic decline, and that legislators should expect a deficit when they come back. So maybe they'll have to put together a supplemental appropriation. So some tools that have been relied on in the past and will likely be part of the solution next session include the Economic Stabilization Fund. The original projection was $9.4 billion. The controller has sort of ballparked that reduction to $8.5 billion, but again, that was not a sort of official forecast from him. We should probably wait until July for that number to come, but that's sort of where he ballparked it just in public comments. The current sufficient balance is $7.5 billion, so just a little bit less than that. Just to be clear on what this means, lawmakers can appropriate below the sufficient balance. It's just that sufficient balance is sort of a trigger when it comes to some of the automatic transfers to the state highway fund, and so it sort of keeps some of the dollars from being transferred out of the Economic Stabilization Fund. But again, just to reiterate, lawmakers can, they can appropriate, well below that sufficient fund balance, in times of emergency like this. And then another tool that we're all familiar with is the delay of the FSP payment. The August payment for 1920 is around 2.3 billion. And again, that's just sort of a ballpark. The way this would work is it would be a delay of next school year's payment, August payment rather. And so that's just something to keep in mind as a tool in the toolbox that legislators can use when they come back. I'm going to pause for a moment. Joe and others, Lynn and Dan, did you guys have any comments you wanted to add on sort of what tools lawmakers could utilize whenever they come back in session?
Yeah, I'll start off commenting that much as we discussed a few minutes ago, if the stimulus funds are flexible, then you can reasonably expect the state legislature to apply some of that in funding the foundation school program formulas. That's pretty much exactly what happened back after the Great Recession, which probably will no longer be counted as the Great Recession. It'll be renamed the Not So Great Recession. This one's probably going to be much more than that. The legislature, if I remember correctly, used, I want to say it's something like $3 or $4 billion in the foundation school program, directly offsetting a need to transfer general revenue to the foundation school fund. And then they could use that general revenue elsewhere in the state budget. So in the 2010 and 2011, that'd be the 2009-10 and 10-11 school years, I don't think there were really any significant cuts in funding because they had the stimulus funds available at that time. However, you'll all recall that back in 2011, when the legislature was meeting, they were looking at a forecasted severe shortfall, kind of a lingering effect of the Great Recession caused by one of the cyclical busts in the oil and gas industry. They ended up cutting public education by reducing various formulas, et cetera. So there's still the potential for there to be repercussions just depending on how all of this plays out in terms of the sequence of events, the timing, et cetera. Another thing I'll mention while we're coming back to state budget issues and local budget issues is we touched early on about the local taxable values, and that 2020 might be largely untouched by this, depending again on that issue of holding the values at 2019 level or not. However, 2021 values likely will be more depressed than you would expect for a couple of different reasons, and varying quite a bit from district to district. Number one, if this is a lingering recessionary effect, and a lot of people are looking at it being that, it will take some time for businesses to come back and begin operating again. That has two implications. Number one, tax collections for the 2020 school year could be a problem. If I were looking at it right now, I would be assuming a low collection percentage, even if the appraisal district holds values relatively flat, if they can do that. That's because those businesses haven't been operating and won't have as much cash available, especially if they don't get some form of a stimulus from the federal government directly. So there's a potential for a lot of businesses to have problems paying their bills as they begin operating again. Secondly, a number of businesses may not open again. Retail establishments that were hanging on, restaurants, etc., may or may not be able to come back, certainly not as rapidly. They may be closed indefinitely, or at least for a more extended period of time, because they have to rehire workers that were laid off, they have to resupply, etc. All of those things look to create a more lingering effect. And to the extent that those businesses don't become operational again, it will have a longer term impact on sales tax revenue, which deepens the state shortfall, which means the state has more to consider, not only for the current biennium, but for next biennium as well. As Josh said, the controller does not currently foresee a shortfall within the current biennium because you can manage the cash in order to continue paying the state's bills and funding foundation school program and health and human services, et cetera. But if this is a much deeper hole, you begin to start talking about making cuts in programs for the 2020-21 fiscal year, school year. The controller's already preparing reports on state spending that might be used to reduce state agency budgets. But if there's a really deep hole, then it is not outside the realm of possibility that they may be desiring deeper cuts in other program areas, including the foundation school program, and more immediately. That's just a lot of speculation of what we all want to keep an eye on for the next several months to see how this shakes out. Right now, my gut feel is no, that's not going to happen. The legislature has the wherewithal to continue through this current fiscal biennium, but next legislative session, it could be a different story for the following biennium. I'll gladly open it up for anybody else to make a comment on that.
All right, Catherine, if you wanted to advance to the next section. And then, of course, this isn't the only thing the legislature is going to have to worry about when they come back in January. It's, again, to remind y'all, it'll be a redistricting session. And then another huge budgetary issue will be the 1115 waiver, which, if it's not granted, could mean some pretty serious additional costs to the state. And then, of course, just other legislative priorities. There's always a push for additional property tax cuts. I know some of the interim charges specifically have to do with the business property tax, or the business, additional property tax cuts for businesses. And then, of course, we all remember the fight about school or local government lobbying last session, and that's likely to return next session. And then I know both the House and Senate have an interim charge looking at special education and TEA's corrective action plan, and kind of monitoring progress on that. And then I'll pause here for a moment for Lynn and Dan and others if they wanted to chime in here to provide some. We have final observations there. I know this nothing seems final right now. It's all in a flux. But if you guys wanted to jump in and provide some context and maybe some assurances here to folks, feel free to jump in.
Josh, we did have a question come in that I think may help guide the final thoughts from you, Dan and Lynn, asking for advice and guidance to school districts in planning for the 2020-21 school year, just there being so many unknowns right now.
I'm grading. I think so much of this is going to hinge around the magnitude of the hole that the state faces in terms of the budget. When Controller Hager talked about it, he essentially was using the same tools that the state would have used with a far lesser impact. Now, some of what we've seen is pretty horrific in terms of the how long it would tend to impact the state. And I think it's really too early to try to get into the mechanics of exactly what it's going to mean to your budget. It is true that the legislature's obligation essentially right now is to continue to fund the legislative payment estimate. which means that this, to some extent, for public ed, could translate into a subsequent biennium in terms of impact as opposed to the immediate biennium. Dan?
Yeah, this is Dan. I think one of the things I share with Joe is less so for 2021, but I think that 21 forward on the property tax side, because we've had a lot of complaints about major retailers using dark stores as the basis for comparison in their funding. Well, if they're all dark stores, then we don't have that much of an argument. And I'm very concerned about how this retail trade's going to bounce back. As far as the Mayfair sales tax on essentially delivery of goods to home, we're trying to do our part. It seems to be around here at my house doing our share on that. But I am concerned. I think the key is going to be, you're probably going to have to budget pretty darn conservatively for some of the collections issues Joe described. And I don't know, that's not terribly great advice right now, but until we see how some of this surfaces, I think in terms of business recovery, I think that's going to be pretty critical.
Other thoughts? Bob?
I think that the best options that you have available in front of you now for the course of the next 5 or 6 weeks is to just keep watching this stuff on a day-to-day basis, and we're going to keep providing information to you as quickly as we can. If you're obviously a T-SPAN member, you're getting those morning updates every day. But there's going to be a point in time where our state leadership makes some decisions about how we proceed with this, and I think that point is when you start making your best observations about how you're going to build a budget for next year. I do think that you can count on, as Joe and them have said previously, that I don't think there's necessarily going to be a cut to funding next year. You're just going to have to answer some local questions of, is your ADA going to be the same? What other services are you going to have to provide based upon missing so much of school this year? What does accountability and assessment look like next year moving forward? And how do you meet those requirements? And that's what's going to be your summer, your long summer. And so if you had to ask me on April the 9th at 2:59, that would be my observation for you. As we move forward over the course of the next 6 weeks, I think we'll get some more clarity. And as always, here at Moat Casey, we'll be here to help you.
Yeah, thanks guys so much. I know if you have questions, feel free to email us with those. I know we want to respect the commissioner's call. That's going to start here in about 60 seconds. But yeah, thanks again so much for joining us. We will post the PowerPoint and this webinar later, and you're always welcome to email us at Moat Casey if you have particular questions that we couldn't answer on the air this afternoon. So thanks so much, and good luck with all of your work ending this school year. Thanks so much.